Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for tonight's story. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I believe this must be it, said my father, taking a swift left-hand turn through the tall, lofty trees, where we arrived at an old rusted cattle gate that looked as if it was over 100 years old, possibly older. My father climbed out of his silver Mercedes and casually walked over to the cattle gate to open it as wide as he could. The gate, with its extensively large cattle grid, creaked and groaned on its hinges, almost as if it had not been oiled for over a century. I noticed the driveway that snaked through the gate was narrow and obscure, heavily fringed by a labyrinth of tall trees, a higgledy-piggledy mix of indigenous specimens typical to the bluegrass state. This was the quintessential road through the woods, you could say. It would have been easily missed or overlooked if you hadn't been paying attention, or if you hadn't known it was there. My father made a satisfied grunt, a purring sound he'd commonly make when he was terribly pleased with himself for his accomplishments, like when he fixed a kitchen cupboard when it had fallen off its hinges for my mother, or sorted out a block drain at home. I suspected he was privately congratulating himself for finding the proverbial needle in the haystack, as Dogwood Manor was discreetly hidden behind these sprawling groves of trees. If my father could have clapped himself on the back, he probably would have done so. I admit I was impressed that he'd found Dogwood Manor, even though he knew Kentucky almost as well as the taxi drivers in London, England, know the length and breadth of the entire square mile of the city, without needing any GPS navigating devices at their disposal. I know this from a recent trip that I had to London. I well knew from past experience that there were indeed secret little pockets of Kentucky, ambiguous, obscure places far off the beaten track that could lead you astray geographically if you didn't know where you were going, and as a consequence you could get hopelessly lost like a ship out at sea. If I'd been wearing my father's shoes and been seated in the driving seat of his Mercedes, I would almost have certainly missed the narrow gap through the trees, even if my GPS had told me I'd arrived at my desired destination. I would have been absolutely certain the GPS had got it horribly wrong, as no one ever said technology was perfect every time. My father pointed to the dubious-looking sign, obstructed by a low overhanging tree branch that was blocking out the faded writing. It read Dogwood Manor. "You'd think they'd make the signpost clearer," said my father, sounding a tad indignant. "I mean, the sign is so discreetly hidden behind the trees. How can they possibly expect anybody to find this place if it's not clearly marked and shrouded from the road so you can't even see it? Sometimes I despair of people. It's pretty logical and straightforward to have a sign that should be seen very clearly from the road so that any passing traffic will know exactly where this place is. But this one is buried away, almost as if the owners of Dogwood Manor themselves don't want anybody to find their property. Never mind, I'm going to make amends about that. Make sure that today everybody knows exactly where Dogwood Manor is. I can taste a sail on my tongue, like the salt in the sea air." "Don't be ridiculous, Dad," I chuckled. "How can you taste a sail? You sound as if you're talking about a T-bone steak served with a side of chips. It doesn't work like that, Dad, I'm most sure." "Oh, but sometimes it does, son," said my father. "Your instincts can be as sharp as a razor, I find. I've been in real estate for a long time, son," he said, fixing his steely grey eyes on me. "There are times you get a profound sense that something is going to bite, like when you go fishing. Remember when we went fishing a lot when you were a little boy? And when you cast out your line into the lake, you would sometimes say to me, 'Dad, I feel lucky today.' And you usually were. I do remember that rather well. Haven't you had days, son, when you just know things are going to go your way? You just sense it in your guts?" "I'm not sure," I said, reflecting on my father's words. "When I get up, I'm never certain what the day is going to bring. But there are some days that feel better than others, I will admit. But it still doesn't mean the day will work out right in the end. I certainly didn't get any gut feeling today, if that's what you want to know, that things would turn out fine. I only came along today to stop Mum nagging me to find out more about what you do as an estate agent. She seems to have this terrible intrinsic fear that if I don't find a career path soon, I'll be left behind, as all my friends seem to know what they want to do with their lives. Well, I wouldn't let that worry you, son. When I was your age, I had absolutely no clue what I wanted to do with my life. So you're not alone on that front. Your mother can overreact at times, but don't tell her I told you that. If you must know, I fell into becoming an estate agent quite by lucky chance. My friend's father happened to be an estate agent, and one day we both helped him out in selling a property. I remember thinking, I could do this, and I never looked back. In the end, he was the first one that gave me my first job. I was a little older than you are at the time. You mark my words, your mother's worrying about nothing. Everything will eventually fall into place. In my experience, it always does. So just you wait and see. And I've got a good feeling that it's going to be a good day. Sometimes it's about getting out of bed on the right side, when everything that day seems to flow with what I would describe as perfect synchronicity. "Oh, is that what they call it, Dad?" I teased. "I can't say I can taste the so-called good flavour in the air that you seem to be talking about. But let's just say I'm going to take what you say with a pinch of salt, Dad, or with a healthy scepticism." "Ah, that's what I like to hear, son. One thing I like to teach you and your sister is not to believe everything you hear, especially if it's written in the press or reported on the mainstream media, as so much stuff is fully manipulated. I dare say this day is going to be a whole new experience for you, isn't it, son? I'm very glad you came along with me today, even if I was under the duress of your well-meaning mother," said my father, looking at me approvingly. "I have to admit, son, you scrub up well. You really do. I'm awfully proud of you, you know. You do look the part. Even your mother looked impressed this morning when she saw you wearing that blue pinstripe suit of yours. Don't tell her I told you this, but she had tears in her eyes. I suspect your mother's beginning to realize you're growing up so fast. It's not easy for her to accept that her 18-year-old boy is becoming an adult. Between you and me, I know she's dreading the day when you finally leave home. If she had her way, you'd be a kid forever, never grow up, and never leave home. That's what she would really like." "Dad, I'm 18. Of course I'm grown up. I'm not a pet that's going to stay at home forever, even if that's what Mum wants. You know what she's like. She gets emotional about absolutely everything. Even if I go away for a weekend, she's upset about that. She claims to miss me so very much. She's also like that with Kate. God forbid we both leave home. She'll fall apart. Well, can you blame her, son? You're her favourite son, aren't you? And Kate her favourite daughter. Well, it's difficult not to be her favourite son, Dad, since she doesn't have any more," I teased. "Nor does she have another daughter, apart from Kate." "The suit really does look great on you, son," said my father, giving me a wink. "Those shoes of yours are so polished I could probably see my reflection in them. You polished them good, son. Military men know about polishing shoes. My father was in the Navy, you know. I never knew a day when his shoes didn't shine like the morning sun." "Well, I'm not exactly comfortable wearing this suit, Dad, if you must know," I said, flinching. "I just don't think I'm a suit guy. I think I would have been better off being a Buddhist monk or something. They wear comfortable, loose-fitting orange clothes, don't they?" I said, playing awkwardly with the zooty tie my mother had insisted I'd worn today, which made me feel as if I'd been trussed up like a turkey. "I prefer to wear trendy, comfortable clothes, but suits can be so tiresome, so uncomfortable, especially when the weather is hot. Well, then you're lucky, son.
It's spring, so the weather isn't exactly warm today. You'll be fine wearing that suit. You young generation don't seem to appreciate some of the old, well-tested ways of presenting yourself." "Well, I just don't get why I can't wear anything I like, Dad. Surely times have changed and suits have gone way out of fashion. Isn't it better to feel comfortable in what you wear? Business suits are so stuffy. If you look at some of those high-tech places, many of them just wear fashionable clothes, like they do at Apple." "Not in this game, son, they don't. If you want to become a real estate agent and follow in my footsteps, then you need to look the part. Nobody wants to buy a house from someone who looks like they've been taking a long leisurely stroll down the beach, wearing denim shorts with a Hawaiian shirt, and have soap drying in their damp hair. In the world of real estate, appearances are absolutely everything. And you know what they say, you never get a second chance to make a first impression." I sniggered. "Is that really true, Dad? Isn't that a bit of old hat?" "Of course it's true, son. Never was a truer word ever spoken. When people buy a property, they often say it's in the first few seconds that a potential buyer will make up their mind about a place. So presentation is absolutely everything. Why do you think houses are often very cleverly staged by skilled, masterful designers, so that buyers can envisage themselves living in that place? You see, son, I hate to tell you this, but in my experience, some people have no imagination whatsoever. I don't mean to be brutally unkind, but it is true. So if they see an empty space, it can be hard for them to imagine living there. That's where the designers are called into play to work their magic. When you kit the place out with furniture, people can begin to see themselves living in that place. If the staging has succeeded in making the place sumptuously cozy and pleasing to the eye, you've pretty much got a sale in the bag. So as far as I'm concerned, staging is well worth the money and the investment." "Wow, you do surprise me, Dad. So it seems first impressions really are important then." "Of course they're important, son. When a potential client visits a property on the market, and the place has got oodles and oodles of curb appeal and charm to attract them, it's a win-win situation. Ostensibly, an estate agent needs to present him or herself very well. If they look as if they've been dragged through a hedge backwards, it's not a pretty picture. It's like anything in life. You have to look the part, don't you? I have a friend who sold real estate for a living. One day she was running late for a couple of clients. She rocked up to show the people around the property. She had accidentally left her pajama bottoms under her dress, and they fell down to her feet in front of her clients. They took one look at her and her pajama bottoms and bolted out of the place like a bat out of hell, as if seeing her in such a dishevelled state had downgraded the value of the property. From that point onwards, she made an extra effort to look her very best, and never ever forgot to remove her pajama bottoms," said my father, chuckling. "Well, that must have been rather amusing to watch, although rather humiliating for the woman. Although I dare say the people concerned were rather shallow and short-sighted, to run away from a property just because the woman's pajama bottoms fell to her feet. But it doesn't change the fact that I don't feel comfortable wearing a suit, Dad. Even if it makes me look smart and professional, I would still prefer to feel comfortable." "Well, you can thank your lucky stars then, son, that you weren't living in the 1800s. In those days, people wore top hats and tails as a daily routine. Women wore corsets, and they were always trussed up to the nines, let me tell you. It couldn't have been desperately comfortable back then, but it was the order of the day, wasn't it? They were always smartly attired. It went with the territory of being a gentleman or a lady." "I suppose, then, I have to be grateful for small mercies, Dad," I said, with a touch of sarcasm in my voice. "I can't imagine what it would have been like living back then. I saw some old footage, you know, of the 1800s on TikTok, and you're right, everyone looked considerably smart. But there were horse-drawn carriages, and there were trams everywhere. It was fascinating to watch. But you're right, I did notice everyone looked terribly smart back in the day, much more so than they do now. I wonder what they would think of how we dress today, and how casual some of us have become over the years." My father nodded. "They would probably not be very impressed or inspired by us. To tell you the truth, son, I'll let you into a little secret. I am rather chuffed to be selling Dogwood Manor for the O'Reilly family. But don't tell Philip Wensleydale I told you so. Thankfully, the O'Reillys have fixed Dogwood Manor up remarkably well. Although, to be fair, they've kept it in reasonably good condition over the years, renting it out to a couple of well-to-do families. The mansion was built in 1873. Philip Wensleydale, the estate agent I work with, visited the place last week. He excitedly told me all about it. He was very pleased about this open day today, that he organised well in advance. Well, if that's the case, Dad, why on earth are you presenting Dogwood Manor today, and not Philip Wensleydale? That doesn't make any sense to me at all. You haven't even seen the property." "That's a whole nother story in itself. As I was saying, son, I consider it a privilege to be able to sell a house like Dogwood Manor. In a nutshell, the O'Reillys never wanted to sell. It's been in the family line for generations, as is often the case with old ancestral homes like this. They have some kind of inverted loyalty towards the place, which is perfectly understandable. It makes them feel rather disinclined to sell. But things have changed exponentially for the O'Reilly family. They are moving to New Zealand, so they decided to restore Dogwood Manor about 6 months ago, for the purposes of putting it onto the market to sell, so that they could acquire the best possible price for the place." "Well, I suppose that makes good financial sense," I said. "Well, it does from their perspective," said my father. "They don't want to be worrying about a family property of theirs in America while living abroad. They feel they need to let it go, although I hasten to say that Mr. O'Reilly is very sad and rather reluctant to be selling it up, especially with Dogwood Manor being in such mint condition. I think the poor man has had some unsettling visions of his deceased ancestors waving their hands in indignation at him, persuading him that he can't abandon the family heritage like this. Well, that is what he told Philip Wensleydale, I believe. I guess selling the place is an emotional tug-of-war for the man." "Well, I'm not surprised to hear that," I said. "I imagine it must be rather hard to sell an old family ancestral home that's been in the family for many generations. I don't think I would find it remotely easy to do that. You feel as if you have a duty of responsibility, an obligation of care for the place, that your previous descendants down the family line took charge of. And if you sell it, there are no guarantees that the place will be well maintained." "Why are they moving to New Zealand anyway?" I asked curiously. "That's a long way to go from home, is it not?" My father rubbed a hand over his lip and paused for a brief moment as he reflected over my question. "Well, I believe the owner of Dogwood Manor, Mr. O'Reilly, has been offered a prominent position of running an up-and-coming American company in New Zealand, which is also being started up in Australia at the same time. From what I gather, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that he would be foolish to refuse, with a kind of pay package that is irresistible and almost impossible to turn down. Beyond that, I think the family fancy a change of scene, and the O'Reillys like the idea of moving to New Zealand. It's a beautiful country, I believe." "Well, it may be beautiful, but it's a whole lot different from America, Dad. I wouldn't personally want to do it myself." "Maybe so, son," said my father, "but they seem to be set on this move. So I hope it works out for them, I really do. Now I better get this place clearly marked, hadn't I? If we fancy getting any sales today, that is. The O'Reillys would like a quick sale, with as little complications as possible. A cash sale would do very nicely indeed." "But do you think a place like Dogwood Manor will sell quickly, Dad?" I asked him. "I mean, by the looks of things, this place is out in the sticks. It's a historical home that is only likely to attract a certain type of person. I'm no professional, but that's a good guess on my part." Besides, it comes with a hefty price tag, doesn't it? So you have to have plenty of money to buy a place like this. It's not that bad, son. Yes, the place may be expensive, but Dogwood Manor is a great investment to a keen buyer. It's solidly built on very strong foundations. As far as I'm concerned, it's a buyer's dream, if they love old houses, that is. And the nearest town, believe it or not, is not very far away. Yes, I do think the place will tick the right boxes for the right buyer, if they come along, given its historic lineage, which will be attractive to many. We just have to hope we won't have to wait for too long. You can sit on some houses for ages and ages, believe me, I know, and there's nothing more frustrating than that. But I think Dogwood Manor will be snapped up pretty quickly. My father climbed back out of his Mercedes again. I wondered why he'd bothered to get back into the car, in the first place, only to get out of it again like a yo-yo in full swing. But that was my energetic father for you, always moving around like a restless animal in a zoo enclosure. I knew that my father needed to erect his estate agent's signs, as he did on every open day, when presenting a property to the public, as a matter of routine. I sat in the passenger side seat rather patiently, while I heard my dad opening up the trunk. He scrambled around in the back of his Mercedes, with much scratching and squeaking, to remove his quintessential tools of the trade. My father marched in his very debonair suit, wearing his pristine leather shoes from the cattle gate to the trees that fringed the borders of the road. I could hear him noisily thumping around rather awkwardly in the ground, banging away as if he was digging a large outside trench. I could hear him muttering under his breath, "Damn, this ground is rock hard. How am I supposed to get this thing in?" I happily listened to some classic rock on the radio, beating my feet against the floor of his Mercedes in time to the music. It was going to be a long, drawn-out day, I thought to myself. I was already dreading it, but I had agreed to come here today, with much persuasion from my mother, who had said it would do me the world of good to see what my father did for a living. "The way I see it," my mother had said to me, "you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, love, as to what path to take in your career. It won't do you any harm at all to spend a day with your father, to learn a bit about his business. It might actually be quite inspirational for you." "Inspirational?" I'd said, letting out a mock laugh. "Are you kidding me, Mum? There's nothing remotely inspirational about selling houses. It's a pretty mundane job, I bet." My mother had raised a brow. "Don't knock it until you try it, son. You might be pleasantly surprised about your father's job. Your father has told me some stories over the years that would make your hair curl." "That," I said sarcastically, "I find rather difficult to believe." I heard my father grunting as he finally managed to put the for sale sign into the stiff, unyielding earth with a mighty, forceful thud. I was to discover later that he'd painstakingly placed the for sale and open day signs outside the entrance that faced the road, popping up a handful of helium balloons on the stand, blue and white I believe they were, and that was to draw attention to the sign, so potential buyers driving down the road would be fully alerted to it. My father sashayed back to his Mercedes, crunching pebbles beneath his perfectly polished shoes. He grunted as he climbed in beside me, sinking gratefully into the leather seats, bringing behind him a trail of dust into the car that made me wheeze, cough and splutter. His perfect shoes were now covered in a layer of thick dust, which my father hurriedly wiped away with a white handkerchief that he retrieved from one of his pockets. "Damn, it's dusty out there. I'm sorry I've made you cough, son. Goodness gracious me, look at my shoes. They were only polished moments before, and now they look filthy. You'll be glad to know I've put the for sale signs and balloons up, so hopefully we can attract some interested parties today. Keep your fingers crossed, will you, son? We could do with some luck on our side." "You think the sign will attract people, do you?" I asked my father curiously. "Well, I don't see why not, son. But there is one thing I've learnt about open days over the years, and that is Well, working as an estate agent, I've learnt that they can be notoriously unpredictable. You can have a day when no one is biting the bait, and just before you pack up to leave, someone comes in unexpectedly. They offer you the asking price for your property. Your deadbeat day turns triumphant. Other times you have an open day, where everyone seems to be biting the bait. They appear to be excited and animated about the place you're showing. They kept telling you that they want to buy it, and that it's exactly what they're looking for. You get such positive feedback. You start to believe you will have an offer by the end of the day. But in the days that follow, nothing happens. So the day you thought was a great success ends up being a train smash. You don't hear a dicky bird from any of the people you thought were interested in buying the property. So it can really get you down at times. You have to learn to be stoic in this job. It's like betting on a horse that is a dead cert to win, and then the horse you think is going to win trails behind all the others and loses the race. So yes, in this job, it's always unpredictable. What exactly do you mean, Dad? I asked. I'm just saying, son, don't be fooled by outside appearances or first impressions. They can be incredibly misleading. Sometimes the most unlikely people, who do not look like they have a brass farthing to rub together, can be the ones that surprise you the most. The golden rule is to treat everyone with great respect, even if you feel they're messing you around, are time wasters. You get people who you think are stringing you along, wasting your time without any intention of buying, and the next thing you know, the joker you never took seriously for a second is the very person that puts in an offer for the house you're selling. So in this business you need to be prepared for all eventualities, all manner of surprises. No 2 days are the same in this business. I've been taken off guard more times than I care to remember, and met people from all walks of life. It sounds like it's more of a roller coaster ride than I imagined, I said. It sure is, son, said my father. He let out an amused chuckle. I'm glad you came with me, son, on this adventure. I apologize it's not an intrepid one, like when we went whitewater rafting together. But at least, on a house showing, you won't be flung into the rapids of the fast-moving water, like last time, and end up being beaten up by the waves. It'll be a lot smoother ride for you, son. Don't knock whitewater rafting, Dad. That was a fun holiday, and I really enjoyed myself. You didn't look like you were having fun at the time, son, my father teased, giving me an amused wink. Ostensibly, I think it's jolly good for you to learn about the world of real estate. There's lots to learn, but I cannot promise you it'll be busy today, as places like this in the middle of nowhere don't exactly have people queuing up in their droves to see them, so you could get rather bored. This is a select, exclusive property that attracts a very special buyer, who will have money and a penchant for historic homes. Having said that, Dogwood Manor is a buyer's dream, as I keep telling you. It's got character, charm, and oodles of history, so it will attract someone who appreciates that kind of thing. I'm most sure. It sounds like I'm going to be bored today, Dad. I can feel it in my bones. Don't say that, son. As I told you, I haven't seen Dogwood Manor myself yet. We will see it very shortly as we drive up this driveway. But as I was telling you, Philip Wensleydale was supposed to be presenting it today. He's only come down with appendicitis. He evaluated Dogwood Manor for the O'Reillys. He was the one that organised the open day. He was so excited about presenting it today. But it's not to be for him, I'm afraid. Philip has assured me that a wealthy couple called Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair have expressed a keen interest in seeing Dogwood Manor. He personally contacted them to tell them about the place. The Sinclairs tend to collect properties like houses and hotels on a monopoly board. I've already sold them 3 houses myself in these parts over the years, all that have a history attached to them. They are the kind of people that like buying property. Philip Wensleydale believes Dogwood Manor will almost certainly float their boat in every regard. I gather Mrs. Sinclair finds old houses steeped in history irresistible, so she may not be able to walk away from Dogwood Manor without putting in an offer for the place. So we need to keep our fingers crossed on that one. I believe the Sinclairs have 2 twin boys. They live in the old Louisville area, in a renovated Victorian home. But they have a few properties to their name. All of them are historical, I understand. Well, that's ridiculous, Dad. I've heard everything now, I said. If they're living in the old Louisville area, they're already surrounded by history. I mean, how many historic houses does one couple need? I'm sorry, I said, shaking my head in annoyance. But this is what bugs me about the insanely rich. I'm struck by their greed. It really bugs me, Dad, that some people have so much money, they spend it so frivolously, while others can't even afford to pay their bills.
My father shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly, in a matter-of-fact way that he always did. Nothing ruffled my father's feathers. He always went with the flow of life like a fallen autumn leaf on the water being directed by the current. The rich are the rich, son, and whether it's fair or not is really not something I want to dwell on right now, if you don't mind. It is true that some people have more money than common sense, if you ask me. But I dare say the Sinclairs will turn any property they buy into a wise investment, possibly rent it out, sit on it for a few years until it triples in value, and then finally sell it again. The one thing the rich are very good at doing, son, is turning their hands into making more and more money. Money they'll probably never need in a lifetime. But that doesn't seem to stop their earnest drive to make yet more money. In this profession we don't complain about things like that. A sale is a sale as far as we're concerned. Besides, the Sinclairs are very good people. We've just got to get Mrs. Sinclair to bite the bait, because she would be the perfect buyer for Dogwood Manor. And furthermore, it would be a cash sale, which the O'Reillys would fully appreciate. Another thing to remember is they will preserve the integrity of the house. Nothing better than a cash sale as far as I'm concerned. It irons out all the complications and hold-ups you get in real estate. My father looked very smart on this open day, but then again he always did when he was selling houses. I had to admit he was not bad looking for a man in his late 40s. Even as his son I recognised this fact. I could only hope I'd look so well turned out and cleanly shaven myself when I reached his age. He still had most of his silvery hair, although I'd noticed that there was a little patch on the top of his head that was getting significantly thinner, which seemed to alarm my father, who was showing a keen interest in hair implants, as he said he didn't want to grow bald. The thought seemed to genuinely alarm him. My mother would call my father her adorable silver fox. I did think his silver hair suited him. It matched his grey eyes, that were like the intriguing colour of dirty ice, and I mean that in a complimentary way. My father always kept himself trim. He didn't like doing excessive training or workouts at the local gym. He was too lazy to spend time doing structured workouts like that. He wasn't into that kind of thing. Instead, he'd take our 2 dogs at home out for a walk every single morning, and he reckoned it kept him in reasonably good shape, and I believe it did. I was used to my father slouching around our Kentucky home, wearing just a pair of shorts and a sloppy T-shirt, which he was so glad to put on after a hard day showing people around some rather opulent, illustrious-looking homes, with intimidating price tags. It was on the spring morning when we were going to showcase Dogwood Manor. We had the whole day ahead of us, and I noticed there was not a single hair out of place on my father's head. I could smell the appreciative musky scent of my father's aftershave that he'd worn since I was a little boy. So it was a smell I was acquainted with, and I always found oddly comforting. "Dogwood Manor," I said to my dad, as he eagerly pressed down the accelerator and drove down the narrow path through the trees. "Why is it called such a lovely name? I kind of like it. It was probably called Dogwood Manor because between the eclectic mix of indigenous woodland trees, so typical of Kentucky from oaks to maples and other specimens, the dogwoods are very predominant here. You can see there are lots of them, bursting with white blossom. They're quite a showy display, are they not?" "They are indeed," I said. "I love spring," said my father. "Everything comes to life at this time of year, does it not? Look how fabulously beautiful the countryside is at the moment.
The dead look from the end of winter has almost certainly abated. It's a good time to sell a house, son. There's something a little bleak about selling places in winter, I find. They never look half as good. But with the dogwoods on display this morning, to match the name of the property, I think things are looking up for a potential sale. Don't you, son? I hope you're right, Dad. I'm afraid I'm not nearly as optimistic and upbeat as you are. But you're right. It's a beautiful spring day, and hopefully it'll attract some business for us. The road through the trees was a long, windy one, but eventually it opened out rather generously, and was surrounded either side by hilly pastures of the greenest grass you have ever seen in your life. It would seem the stone-washed grass of winter had retreated, like an old forgotten memory. There were perfect meadows for horses to frolic around in happily, in the spring sunshine, although on this occasion there were none around, which was an awful pity, for they would be a welcome sight on this expansive property, where they would almost certainly belong. We passed a red barn and some smart-looking outbuildings, containing what looked like a mix of farming machinery, some of ancient origins, but all in good condition. There was a recently renovated stable block that had been painted in a crisp white colour. It was obviously prepared for any future owner to move in horses onto the property straight away. In a trice, Dogwood Manor slowly came into view, looking like a matchbox in the distance, getting bigger and bigger as we made our approach. The prepossessing red-bricked house was set up proudly against a cheerful hilly backdrop of green grass, impregnated with pretty spring flowers that were bursting all over the countryside. The manor house was nestled under the umbrella of a few grandiose ancient oak trees that were wearing the hallmarks of spring proudly on their branches, that were covered with a plethora of fresh leaves. The front yard was absolutely pristine, with neatly manicured flower beds and hedges that had been shaped to perfection by someone who clearly knew what they were doing with a pair of garden shears, and using some artistic ingenuity. The beautiful red-brick manor home wore its illustrious history with a pompous pride, like a grand overcoat, that made only 2 words come out of my mouth. Oh, wow! For me to be wowed by anything was unusual, as I was the kind of easy-going person that didn't get wowed by very much, until now, of course. Houses had never interested me much, but this place enchanted me. Dogwood Manor was like opening up a history book, shooting back in time on a time machine. I could almost imagine all the servants from yesteryear gathering around outside the property, like they do in the movies, as the original very pompous well-to-do owner returned home, seated in the back of his horse and carriage, with his wife at his side from a long journey. I could envisage these servants bowing their heads politely to greet their master as he entered the house with his beautiful wife, linking arms with him, wearing one of those extravagant resplendent gowns they wore in that time, that were tightly pinched in at the waist and boasted a full skirt, made out of the finest, most exquisite material. For a moment I was caught up in this revelry of the colourful inspirational snapshots of history that, for reasons I could not comprehend, engaged my full attention and flashed rather impertinently into my mind, almost as if I was watching a video of the people who had lived here at one point in time. I wondered as I scrutinised Dogwood Manor through the critical lens of my discerning eyes, whether other people visiting such a place would feel its history as much as I did. It was so tangible to me. I had never experienced a feeling like this before when visiting an old house. It was not that I thought for a fleeting moment that the house was possibly haunted. Indeed, such a thought never even crossed my mind or occurred to me. The house for me fully embodied the memories of those who'd lived there before, and their essences had somehow brought the house to life. It's a little like mixing many flavours together in a bowl of fruit punch, and then you end up with an interesting concoction of flavours, which has everybody asking you for your secret recipe, and even you don't remember how many strange eclectic mixes of flavours you put into the punch. The house was like that, flavoursome in its personality, wholesome in its warmth, and grand in its stateliness. Suddenly it made sense to me why some people were drawn to houses like this. I had always been the type of person that liked minimal design and cutting-edge architecture, but on seeing Dogwood Manor, prettily dappled in the morning light, impregnated with the memories of those long since dead. I suddenly realized how special this house actually was. "She's a beauty, is she not?" said my father, as if he was talking about an old boat that he'd fixed up. "They don't make houses like this any more, do they? And a house like this," said my father, turning to me, "will never age. You know that, son, don't you? We'll probably be outlived by this house."
So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.